let's dive straight in. We're looking at something quite unusual, not a groundbreaking Durkheim text, but rather his lecture notes from when he was just starting out, teaching philosophy in a provincial French town back in the 1880s. These aren't his own words, but they capture his thinking at that very early stage. Now, many folks picture Durkheim as this guy who just threw the baby out with the bathwater, ditching philosophy altogether for hard-nosed sociology, maybe even seeing Auguste Comte as his hero. Or perhaps others see him as a clever Kantian who just applied social methods to old philosophical puzzles. But hold on, the real story as hinted here is more nuanced. Think of Durkheim's entire sociological enterprise not as a break from philosophy, but as a radical new form of philosophy itself. It's like saying sociology became the new playground for tackling those big ancient questions about knowledge, morality, and reality, but using empirical methods. When he later compared pragmatism and sociology, he wasn't just noting they were trendy together. He saw a shared spirit, a quest for answers using fresh approaches to evidence. This empirical wasn't just about looking inside your head. It was about engaging with the world systematically. So, what did Durkheim actually talk about in these lectures? Well, no surprise there, he dives deep into moral philosophy and epistemology, the bedrock of his later work. But then, things get interesting. He tackles aesthetics, something almost entirely absent from his later writings. And get this, metaphysics and the philosophy of religion. Now, Durkheim spent his life wrestling with religion sociologically, but here in these early days, he's defending arguments for God's existence and the soul's immortality. That's a complete U-turn from his later stance. It's like watching a future atheist defend the very things he'd later critique. Why the difference? Partly, it's just the curriculum of the time. You had to cover the whole philosophical landscape. But it also gives us a fascinating snapshot of a mind still exploring different paths before settling on his unique sociological path. To really grasp Durkheim, we can't just look at him in isolation. We need to see him surrounded by his contemporaries, the philosophical debates swirling around him in France during the late 19th century. Think of it like trying to understand a modern artist without knowing their gallery or the art movements they reacted against. Often, we treat the history of sociology and philosophy as separate streams, but Durkheim lived at the confluence. His work needed legitimacy from philosophers, who held immense power in the academic system. Understanding this context helps us see how sociology emerged as a distinct discipline and maybe even prompts us to rethink the relationship between philosophy and sociology today. Interestingly, George Herbert Mead tried to map this French intellectual landscape, though he missed Durkheim entirely. These lectures help fill that gap. Okay, so how do we get these lectures into English? They come from student notes, likely taken by André Lalande, a bright kid who'd go on to write a famous philosophical dictionary. The key point here is that these notes probably weren't checked by Durkheim himself. So the translators faced a choice. Stick rigidly to Lalande's wording, which might be awkward or repetitive, or try to capture the meaning while making it flow better in English. They chose the latter. They focused on what Durkheim likely meant, reorganizing sentences, using better English equivalents, and even cutting out bits that felt like filler. They kept only Lalande's notes that seemed genuinely insightful. The goal was tricky. Stay true to Durkheim's ideas and his style as a teacher, but make it accessible without sounding like a 16-year-old's homework. A tall order. Let's set the scene. It's 1882. Durkheim, just 24, fresh out of the prestigious École Normale Supérieure, has aced the tough aggregation exam needed to teach philosophy. But here's the twist, he bombs it. Placing near the bottom, maybe due to illness, he gets sent not to a fancy Paris school, but to a smaller one in Sens, a quiet town far from the capital. Imagine being the brightest star at the École Normale, only to end up in provincial exile. His job? Teach a massive year-long intro course covering pretty much all of Western philosophy. Think of it as the philosophical equivalent of a freshman seminar, but condensed into 80 lectures. He gave this course twice, once in 82 to 83, then again in 83 to 84 before moving on. These lectures represent the absolute beginning of his professional career. Why should we care about these early philosophy lectures? Two big reasons. First, Durkheim's sociology was never separate from philosophy, it was deeply intertwined. But exactly how? How did he convince philosophers, the gatekeepers of academia, that sociology was a legitimate, distinct field worthy of study? How did he use sociology to tackle ethical questions or even metaphysics? These lectures offer clues to the philosophical toolkit he was building. Second, these lectures might hold the key to when the idea of an empirical science of society actually took root in France. We often think classical sociology popped up because of huge societal shifts like industrialization. But maybe it started earlier, in specific local contexts, like Durkheim's own experience. Did his commitment to empirical methods form right after École Normale? Or did it solidify later, perhaps after his trip to Germany or when he got his first university post? These lectures could help pinpoint that crucial moment. For decades, scholars knew these lectures existed but couldn't access them. Then in 1995, a bombshell discovery. Librarians at the Sorbonne stumble upon a hefty manuscript, over 500 pages long, titled precisely Durkheim's Lectures on Philosophy at Lycée de Sens. Turns out, it was penned by none other than André Lalande, the student whose notes we're translating. And it's not just random scribbles. It's remarkably detailed, almost like a transcription, with outlines for each lecture. Imagine the excitement. Scholars grabbed copies, posted them online, and suddenly the field exploded with analysis. John Brooks used it to argue that Victor Cousin, not Comte, was a bigger influence. Warren Schmaus revisited Durkheim's ideas on how we learn basic concepts like time and space. And Robert Jones pointed out something fascinating. These lectures show almost no hint of the social realism Durkheim later championed, suggesting maybe German empirical psychology, like Wundt's work, was the real catalyst for his methodological shift. But here's the rub. Getting through these lectures isn't easy. Most haven't been published, and none in English. Plus, remember, Lalande was just 16. His notes, while capturing Durkheim's substance, probably reflect his own formal, sometimes repetitive, writing style, charming, but not exactly publishable prose. More disorienting is how utterly different they feel compared to the Durkheim we know. Where's the focus on social structures, the sui generis reality of the social? It's almost entirely absent. There's no mention of sociology. The empiricism is superficial, talk about science, then default to introspection. On religion, he's defending traditional proofs. On the origins of thought, he leans towards innate ideas, not social construction. This shocking unfamiliarity raises two big questions. Are these really Durkheim's lectures? And if so, are these his genuine views, or just what he was teaching based on some standard syllabus? So how convincing is the claim that this is Durkheim? We can't be 100% sure, but the evidence is compelling. Lalande himself, years later, recalled details that perfectly match the manuscript. He described Durkheim's teaching as highly organized, systematic, exactly how the lectures read. He mentioned Durkheim drawing detailed outlines on the blackboard at the end of each class, and guess what? Those outlines are in the manuscript. Lalande also noted that students copied notes from the previous year's class, which matches the title page of the manuscript. And Lalande specifically remembered Durkheim discussing Schopenhauer, a philosopher unknown to most teens, and indeed, Lecture 7 covers Schopenhauer critically. While nothing is definitive proof, this convergence of details strongly suggests Durkheim is indeed the lecturer behind these notes. We don't know of any other plausible candidate. Okay, so they're Durkheims, but they seem so un-Durkheimian. Are there any hints of the thinker he would become? Yes, there are. For instance, his view of science in these lectures already echoes his later social realism. He argues a science needs a suitable object, something distinct and well-defined, much like Boutroux, his teacher, argued, and like Durkheim would later insist in rules of sociological method. Also, notice his approach to belief. He doesn't just dismiss common sense or religious conviction. In Lecture 2, he says common sense, though biased, has a rational basis and must be explained. How did it arise? Later, in lectures 39 to 40, he links strong certainty in beliefs, including religious ones, to our sensibilities shaped by upbringing, habits, etc. Isn't that exactly the approach he'd take in his sociology of religion? Instead of saying faith is irrational, he wants to understand why people feel so strongly, tracing it back to social influences shaping our sensibility. See the connection? And it doesn't stop there. Even though he hasn't developed the language yet, the Sens lecturer clearly sees that human behavior isn't just about maximizing self-interest. He acknowledges actions guided by something beyond pure calculation. Think about suicide. While he's not analyzing statistics, he argues suicide violates the moral law, implying not everyone who commits suicide is driven by selfishness or cowardice. Doesn't that foreshadow his famous distinction between egoistic and altruistic suicide? And he criticizes Rousseau's view that society is artificial, arguing humans are naturally social beings, something he'd repeat later. These aren't just isolated points. They suggest a continuity of thought, showing how the seeds of his later, groundbreaking ideas were already present, waiting to be cultivated. So wrapping up, these lectures from Sens are far more than just historical curiosities. They offer a vital window into the formative years of one of sociology's founding fathers. They show us a young Durkheim wrestling with the big questions, navigating the philosophical currents of his time, and beginning to lay the intellectual groundwork for the revolutionary sociological project he would later bring to fruition. Understanding this early chapter is absolutely essential for anyone wanting to fully appreciate the depth and complexity of Durkheim's legacy.